The old guitar case made a soft thud as it hit the floor of the community center. Jake wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans and looked around the bright room filled with shiny instruments and confident faces. Everyone else seemed to belong here. Everyone else looked like they had money. Jake's guitar wasn't much to look at. The wood had scratches and dents from years of use. One of the tuning pegs was loose and wobbled when he turned it. His grandfather had given it to him 3 years ago, right before he passed away. "This guitar has stories to tell," the old man had said with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "But first you need to learn its language." The summer music program was supposed to be free, but Jake quickly realized that nothing was really free when you were poor. The other kids had cases that cost more than his family's monthly grocery budget. Their guitars gleamed under the fluorescent lights, fresh from music stores with price tags that would make his mother cry. Jake's mother worked double shifts at the diner downtown. She left for work before he woke up and came home after he went to bed most days. The dark circles under her eyes told the story of a woman fighting to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. When Jake had shown her the flyer for the music program, she had smiled that tired smile he knew so well. "If it makes you happy, honey, we'll find a way," she had said, even though they both knew finding ways was getting harder each month. The music room smelled like wood polish and new strings. Posters of famous musicians lined the walls, their faces frozen in moments of pure joy as they played. Jake wondered if he would ever feel that kind of happiness, that freedom he saw in their expressions. Right now he mostly felt nervous and out of place. A girl with perfectly straight blonde hair sat in the front row, her guitar propped against a stand that probably cost more than Jake's sneakers. She was talking to another student about her private lessons and the summer camp she attended in the mountains. Their conversation drifted over to Jake like smoke, reminding him of all the things he couldn't afford. Jake had never taken a real lesson. Everything he knew came from watching videos on the library computer and practicing in his bedroom with the volume turned down so he wouldn't disturb the neighbors. His fingers had learned to find the right spots on the fretboard through hours of repetition. Guided only by his ear and his grandfather's old songbooks, the teacher walked in carrying a coffee cup and a stack of sheet music. Ms. Rodriguez looked like someone who had spent her whole life around music. Her movements had rhythm even when she was just walking across the room. She set her things down on the desk and smiled at the group of 15 teenagers scattered around the room. "Welcome to your first day," she said, her voice warm but professional. "I know some of you have been playing for years and others are just starting. That's okay. Music isn't about where you come from or how much your instrument costs. It's about what you can make it say." Jake felt a small spark of hope at those words, but it was quickly dampened when he looked around at his classmates again. Easy for her to say, he thought. She probably never had to choose between new strings and lunch money. The morning moved slowly through basic exercises and introductions. Each student had to say their name and how long they'd been playing. When it was Jake's turn, he mumbled his response and looked down at his hands. 3 years didn't sound like much compared to the girl who'd been playing since she was 5, or the boy who bragged about his collection of 6 guitars at home. During the break, Jake stayed in his seat while the other students clustered in small groups, talking about concerts they'd attended and music camps they were planning to attend. He pulled out his phone, not because he had anyone to text, but because it gave him something to do with his hands. The guitar felt heavier than usual when he picked it up after the break. His grandfather's initials were carved into the back, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Jake ran his thumb over the letters and tried to remember the old man's voice, the way he hummed while he played, the patience in his weathered hands as he showed Jake where to place his fingers. "Your grandfather was something special," his mother had told him once. "He could make that guitar sing like it was alive. I used to sit on the porch and listen to him play for hours. He said music was the only language that everyone could understand, no matter where they came from." Jake wished his grandfather was here now. He wished he could ask him what to do when you loved something, but felt like you didn't deserve to be in the same room as people who had everything handed to them. He wished he could ask him how to find confidence when your clothes came from thrift stores and your guitar case was held together with duct tape. The afternoon session focused on basic techniques. Miss Rodriguez walked around the room, listening to each student play simple scales and chords. When she got to Jake, she paused for a moment longer than she had with the others. Her eyes moved from his face to his guitar to his hands positioned on the fretboard. "That's a beautiful instrument," she said quietly. "It has character." Jake wasn't sure if she was being polite or if she really meant it, but something in her voice made him look up. For just a moment, he saw something in her eyes that looked like recognition, as if she understood more than she was saying. As the first day came to an end, Jake packed his guitar carefully back into its worn case. The other students were already making plans to meet up and practice together. They exchanged phone numbers and talked about the coffee shop down the street, where they might grab something after tomorrow's session. Jake walked to the bus stop alone, carrying his guitar and trying not to think about how different he was from everyone else in the program. The city bus was crowded with people heading home from work, their faces tired and distant. Through the window, Jake watched the neighborhoods change from the nice area around the community center to the worn-down streets where he lived. His apartment building looked smaller somehow when he got home, as if spending the day around all that wealth had shrunk his world even more. But when he opened his guitar case in his small bedroom and placed his fingers on the familiar strings, something shifted. The guitar didn't care about his clothes or his address or the fact that his case was falling apart. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "This guitar has stories to tell." Maybe, Jake thought as he began to play softly in the growing darkness. It was time to start telling them. The music that came from his fingers that evening was different somehow, touched by the day's experiences and the weight of dreams that felt both impossible and necessary. Outside his window, the city hummed its endless song, and Jake added his own quiet melody to the mix, note by careful note. The second week of the music program felt different. Jake had gotten used to the routine of taking 2 buses to get to the community center, and he no longer jumped every time someone laughed loudly in the hallway. But he still felt like he was watching everything through glass, like he belonged to a different world than the other students. Ms. Rodriguez had been teaching them about chord progressions all week. She would write combinations of letters on the whiteboard and explain how certain chords naturally flowed into others. C major to A minor, G major back to C. The patterns made sense to Jake in a way that surprised him. It was like learning the grammar of a language he already knew how to speak. "Music theory isn't about rules," Ms. Rodriguez had said during Tuesday's class. "It's about understanding why certain things sound good together. Once you know the why, you can break the rules and make something beautiful." Jake thought about that a lot. He had been breaking rules without knowing it for 3 years, playing combinations that felt right even when he didn't know their names. His grandfather had never taught him theory. The old man just showed him where to put his fingers and told him to listen with his heart. By Thursday, the other students were getting restless. They had been working on the same basic progressions all week, and Jake could see the boredom creeping into their faces. The girl with the expensive guitar case kept checking her phone. The boy who owned 6 guitars at home started playing random riffs during breaks, showing off techniques that had nothing to do with what they were learning. Jake understood their frustration, but for him, every lesson felt like discovering something new about his grandfather's guitar. Each chord progression was like finding another room in a house he thought he knew completely. The CGMF pattern they had been practicing all week reminded him of a song his grandfather used to hum while he cooked dinner. A melody Jake had never been able to place until now. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly. The community center felt different with rain pattering against the windows. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher somehow, and the room smelled like wet concrete instead of wood polish. Jake arrived early, as he always did, and sat in his usual spot in the back corner. The other students trickled in over the next few minutes, shaking rain from their jackets and complaining about the weather. Their conversations buzzed around topics Jake couldn't join. Weekend plans at country clubs, family vacations to places he had only seen in magazines, college prep courses that cost more than his mother made in a month. Ms. Rodriguez walked in looking tired. She set her coffee cup down harder than usual and stared at the lesson plan on her desk for a long moment, before looking up at the class. "Okay," she said, clapping her hands together. "We've been working on chord progressions all week. Time to see what you've learned." A uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Jake could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. The students who had been so confident during casual conversation suddenly looked uncertain when faced with the possibility of performing alone. "Need someone to demonstrate the CGA minor F progression we've been practicing," Ms. Rodriguez continued scanning the room with her eyes. Just the basic pattern. Nothing fancy, more silence. Jake watched as several students suddenly found their shoes very interesting. The girl with the blonde hair was studying her fingernails. The boy with 6 guitars was adjusting his tuning pegs even though his guitar was perfectly in tune. Anyone? Ms. Rodriguez asked again, and Jake could hear a note of disappointment creeping into her voice. This was the moment Jake had been dreading all week. Not because he couldn't play the progression, but because he knew he could. And he knew that once he started playing, something might happen that he couldn't control. His grandfather's guitar had a way of taking simple things and turning them into something more complicated. But Ms. Rodriguez looked so tired, and the room felt so heavy with everyone's reluctance. Jake thought about his mother working double shifts, about his grandfather's voice telling him that music was the only universal language. He thought about all the hours he had spent in his small bedroom, playing quietly so he wouldn't disturb anyone, always hiding what he could do. Slowly, Jake raised his hand. Every head in the room turned toward him. He felt heat rising in his cheeks as 20 pairs of eyes focused on his corner of the room. For a moment, he considered pretending he had just been stretching, making some excuse and putting his hand back down. "Jake?" Ms. Rodriguez said, and there was something in her voice that sounded like hope. "Would you like to try?" Jake nodded because his throat felt too tight to speak. He picked up his grandfather's guitar and moved to the front of the room on shaking legs. The chair they had set up for demonstrations felt like it was 1,000 miles away from his safe spot in the back corner. He sat down and positioned the guitar on his lap, his fingers automatically finding their familiar places on the neck. The room was so quiet he could hear the rain against the windows and the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Someone coughed and it sounded as loud as thunder. "Just the basic CGA minor F progression," Ms. Rodriguez reminded him gently. "Take your time." Jake looked down at his hands and tried to calm his racing heart. He could do this. It was just 4 chords. Just the pattern they had been practicing all week. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would draw too much attention. He pressed his fingers down on the strings and played the first chord, C major. Clean and simple, just like Ms. Rodriguez had taught them. Then G major, letting it ring out the way his grandfather had shown him. A minor came next, and Jake felt something shift in his chest. The chord sounded sad and beautiful at the same time, like it was asking a question. Then F major, and suddenly Jake was back in his grandfather's small kitchen, watching weathered hands move across guitar strings while soup simmered on the stove. The progression was the same one the old man had played 1,000 times, but Jake had never connected it to the theory they were learning in class. Without thinking, Jake let his fingers move beyond the basic pattern. The CGMF progression became something more fluid, more alive. His right hand started picking individual strings instead of just strumming chords. The melody his grandfather used to hum began to emerge from the guitar, note by note, like a story being told. The room disappeared around him. There was only Jake and his grandfather's guitar and the music that had been waiting inside both of them for so long. His fingers found harmonics and grace notes and subtle bends that made the simple progression sound like something completely different. The rain against the windows became part of the rhythm. The fluorescent lights humming overhead became part of the harmony. Jake had no idea how long he played. Time seemed to stretch and compress like the strings under his fingers. The music flowed through him like water, carrying memories and emotions he didn't even know he had been holding on to. His grandfather's voice was there in every note, patient and encouraging, telling him to listen with his heart instead of his head. When the last chord finally faded away, Jake opened his eyes and looked up at the room. The silence that greeted him was different from the uncomfortable quiet that had filled the space before. This silence felt full, like the moment after lightning before the thunder comes. Ms. Rodriguez was staring at him with her mouth slightly open. Several of the other students had tears in their eyes that they seemed surprised to find there. The girl with the blonde hair was leaning forward in her seat, her expensive guitar forgotten beside her. Jake suddenly realized what he had done. He had meant to play 4 simple chords and instead had poured his heart out in front of 20 strangers. His cheeks burned with embarrassment as he looked around at their faces, all of them focused on him with an intensity that made him want to disappear. "I'm sorry," he started to say, his voice barely a whisper. "I know you said just the basic pattern. I don't know what happened. But Ms. Rodriguez held up her hand to stop him, and when she spoke, her voice was soft with something that sounded like wonder. "Jake," she said, and the way she said his name made it sound important. "Where on earth did you learn to play like that?" Jake's hands trembled as he set his grandfather's guitar back in its case. The room was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It felt heavy with something he couldn't name. Everyone was looking at him like he had just performed magic, and in a way, maybe he had. He wasn't sure what had happened to him up there. One moment he was playing simple chords, and the next his fingers were moving on their own, telling stories he didn't know he remembered. Ms. Rodriguez walked over to his chair, her footsteps echoing in the silent room. She knelt down beside him, her voice so soft that only he could hear. "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Have you been taking private lessons somewhere else?" Jake shook his head quickly. "No, ma'am. I told you. I learned everything from my grandfather and some videos at the library." "Your grandfather," she repeated, and something in her tone made Jake look up at her face. "Tell me about him. What kind of music did he play?" Jake glanced around the room. The other students were pretending to pack up their instruments, but he could tell they were all listening. Their conversations were too quiet, too forced. He had never talked about his grandfather to anyone except his mother. "He used to play in his country before he came here," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Back when he was young, he told me stories about playing in cafes and small theaters. But when he moved to America, he had to work in factories. He never stopped playing, though. Every night after work, he would sit on our porch with his guitar." Ms. Rodriguez nodded slowly, like pieces of a puzzle were clicking together in her mind. "What country was he from?" "Spain," Jake said. "He came here when he was 25. He used to say that music was the only thing he could bring with him that couldn't be taken away." The teacher's eyes widened. "Jake, did your grandfather ever tell you his full name? What he did before he came to America?" Jake felt confused. Why was she asking all these questions? His name was Antonio Rivera. He used to joke that he had 2 jobs in Spain, guitarist by night, dreamer by day. "Why are you asking?" Ms. Rodriguez sat back on her heels, and Jake saw something like shock flash across her face. She stood up quickly and walked to her desk, pulling out her phone. Her fingers moved rapidly across the screen, and Jake watched her face change as she read whatever she had found. "Class," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet conversations. "I want everyone to sit back down for a moment." The students looked confused but returned to their seats. Jake wanted to disappear into the floor. Whatever was happening, he was at the center of it, and he didn't like the feeling. Ms. Rodriguez held up her phone, showing them a black and white photograph of a young man with a guitar. The man in the picture had Jake's eyes and his grandfather's smile. "This is Antonio Rivera," she said, her voice filled with something that sounded like awe. "He was one of Spain's most promising classical guitarists in the 1960s. He was supposed to perform at some of the biggest venues in Europe." Jake stared at the photograph, his heart pounding. The young man in the picture looked so much like his grandfather, but also different somehow. Confident, like someone who belonged on stage in front of hundreds of people. "He disappeared from the music world in 1968, Ms. Rodriguez continued. "No one knew what happened to him. Music historians have been wondering for decades why such a talented musician would just vanish at the height of his career." The room was completely silent now. Jake felt like he couldn't breathe. All these years, his grandfather had been just his grandfather. A quiet old man who worked in a factory and played guitar on the porch. Jake had never imagined that anyone else in the world knew his name. "The playing style Jake just demonstrated," Ms. Rodriguez said, looking directly at him. "It's called the Rivera technique. Your grandfather developed it. Music schools in Spain still teach it today." Jake's mind was spinning. He thought about all those evenings on the porch, watching his grandfather's fingers move across the strings. The old man had made it look so effortless, so natural. Jake had learned to play the same way without knowing he was learning something that had a name, something that people studied in schools. "But why did he leave?" asked the girl with the blonde hair, speaking for the first time that day. "Why would he give up a career like that?" Ms. Rodriguez looked at Jake as if asking permission to continue the story. Jake nodded, even though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear what came next. "From what I can find here," she said, reading from her phone, "Antonio Rivera was supposed to perform at a major festival in Madrid in 1968. But there was political trouble in Spain at the time. Some musicians were speaking out against the government. Antonio's name appears on a list of artists who were, let's say they weren't welcome anymore. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. His grandfather had never talked about politics or why he left Spain. Whenever Jake asked, the old man would just smile sadly and say, "Some stories are better left in the past."
Mi nieto. He didn't abandon music, Jake said suddenly.
Surprised by the strength in his own voice. He played every single day until he died. He taught me everything he knew. He said music was bigger than any one person, bigger than any government or any stage. He said it belonged to everyone. Ms. Rodriguez smiled, and Jake saw tears gathering in her eyes. That sounds exactly like something Antonio Rivera would say. The articles I'm reading describe him as someone who believed music should bring people together, not divide them. Jake thought about his grandfather's hands, scarred from years of factory work, but still gentle on the guitar strings. He thought about the way the old man would close his eyes when he played, like he was somewhere else entirely. Maybe he had been. Maybe every night on that porch Antonio Rivera had been back in those Spanish cafes, playing for people who understood what music could do. "Jake," Ms. Rodriguez said, and her voice was different now, more serious. "What you just played, it wasn't just good. It was extraordinary. You have a gift that most people spend their entire lives trying to develop. But more than that, you have something that can't be taught. You have soul." Jake didn't know what to say. He had never thought of his playing as extraordinary. It was just something he did, like breathing or walking. But looking around the room at his classmates' faces, he saw something new. Not pity or confusion, but respect. Maybe even a little bit of awe. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice small. Ms. Rodriguez walked back over to him, and this time when she knelt down, she put her hand on his shoulder. "Now, Jake, we make sure the world knows that Antonio Rivera's music didn't disappear. It just found a new voice." Jake looked down at his grandfather's guitar case, thinking about all the songs still locked inside those worn strings. For the first time since his grandfather had died, Jake didn't feel like he was carrying the old man's memory alone. The music had always been there, waiting. It had been passed down like a precious gift, from weathered hands to young ones, from one generation to the next. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to let that gift see the light. The rain had stopped while they were talking, and afternoon sunlight was streaming through the windows. Jake could almost hear his grandfather's voice in the golden light, proud and encouraging, telling him the same thing he had said every day for 3 years. "This guitar has stories to tell, mi nieto. But first you must be brave, enough to tell them." Jake was finally ready to listen. The weekend after Jake's performance felt like living in a dream he wasn't sure he wanted to wake up from. Ms. Rodriguez had asked him to stay after class on Friday, and what she told him still didn't feel real. She had spent hours that evening making phone calls to people Jake had never heard of. Music professors, directors of conservatories, people who apparently cared very much about a guitar technique that his grandfather had developed 50 years ago, in a country Jake had never seen. "I recorded your performance on my phone," she had told him as they sat in the empty music room. "I hope you don't mind. But Jake, there are people who need to hear this. People who have been studying your grandfather's work for decades without knowing what happened to him." Jake had nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood what she meant. All weekend, he kept thinking about that photograph she had shown them. His grandfather as a young man, confident and bright-eyed, holding a guitar like it was the most important thing in the world. Jake tried to imagine that young man becoming the quiet factory worker who had raised him, but the pieces didn't quite fit together in his mind. On Saturday morning, Jake's phone rang. His mother was at work and he almost didn't answer the unknown number. But something made him pick up. "Is this Jake Rivera?" The voice on the other end had an accent Jake couldn't place. "Yes, sir," Jake said, suddenly formal. "My name is Professor Martinez. I teach classical guitar at the university here in the city. Ms. Rodriguez sent me a recording of your performance on Friday."
"I was wondering if I could meet with you." Jake's heart started racing.
"I don't know. I don't take formal lessons or anything. That's exactly why I want to meet with you," Professor Martinez said, and Jake could hear a smile in his voice. "Would Monday afternoon work? I could come to you if that's easier." Jake looked around their small apartment with its second-hand furniture and peeling wallpaper. "Maybe we could meet at the community center instead." "Perfect. I'll see you there at 4 o'clock. After he hung up, Jake sat on his bed holding his grandfather's guitar, trying to process what was happening. 3 days ago, he was just a kid trying not to be noticed in a free music program. Now professors were calling him, wanting to meet with him. It felt too big, too fast. That evening, Jake's mother came home from her double shift at the diner looking exhausted as always. But when Jake told her about the phone call and everything Ms. Rodriguez had discovered about his grandfather, something changed in her face. She sat down heavily at their small kitchen table and put her head in her hands. "Mom," Jake said, suddenly worried. "Are you okay?" She looked up at him with tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. "Your grandfather made me promise never to tell you about his past. He was so afraid that if people knew who he was, they might try to use you somehow. He wanted you to love music for itself, not because of who he used to be." Jake felt his chest tighten. "So you knew? You knew he was famous?" "I knew he was extraordinary," she said softly. "When I was a little girl before you were born, I used to watch him play and wonder how someone with such incredible talent could be so humble about it. He always said his greatest achievement wasn't the concerts or the recognition. It was teaching you to hear music the way he did." They talked until late that night. Jake learned things about his grandfather he had never known. How the old man had saved every penny to buy Jake his first set of strings. How he had practiced scales quietly in the garage so he wouldn't wake the neighbors, keeping his fingers nimble even as arthritis set in. How he had written down songs in a notebook, melodies he remembered from Spain, hoping someday Jake might want to learn them. Monday afternoon came too quickly. Jake arrived at the community center early, his stomach churning with nerves. Ms. Rodriguez was already there, setting up chairs in the music room. She smiled when she saw him. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Scared," Jake answered honestly. "Good," she said. "That means this matters to you." Professor Martinez arrived exactly at 4 o'clock. He was a small man with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a guitar case that looked older than Jake's grandfather's instrument, and when he smiled, his whole face crinkled up like paper. "You must be Jake," he said, extending his hand. "It's an honor to meet you." They talked for a few minutes about school and the music program, but Jake could tell the professor was eager to hear him play. Finally, Ms. Rodriguez suggested that Jake demonstrate some of what he had learned from his grandfather. Jake opened his guitar case and lifted out the familiar instrument. His hands were shaking slightly, but as soon as his fingers touched the strings, the nervousness began to fade. He started with simple scales, the ones his grandfather had taught him first. Then he moved into more complex pieces, letting the music flow the way it always had. Professor Martinez listened with his eyes closed, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of appreciation. When Jake finished, the older man was quiet for a long time. "Remarkable," he finally said. "Jake, what you're playing, it's not just your grandfather's technique. You've evolved it. You've made it your own." Jake didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "Your grandfather developed a very specific approach to classical guitar," Professor Martinez explained. "It combined traditional Spanish techniques with influences from flamenco and even some jazz elements. Very innovative for its time. But what you're doing, you've taken those foundations and added something entirely new, something that comes from growing up here, in this culture, with these influences around you." Jake looked down at his guitar, trying to process what he was hearing. "Is that good or bad?" Professor Martinez laughed. "It's extraordinary. Music is supposed to evolve, Jake. It's supposed to grow and change with each generation. Your grandfather would be incredibly proud. What happened next changed everything." Professor Martinez pulled out his own guitar, a beautiful instrument with wood so polished it seemed to glow. He began to play one of the pieces Jake had just performed, but in a more traditional style. "This is how your grandfather would have played it in Spain," he said. Then he stopped and gestured for Jake to play the same piece. "Now show me how you play it." Jake played the melody the way he always had, the way that felt natural to him. When he finished, Professor Martinez was shaking his head in amazement. "Do you hear the difference?" he asked. Jake nodded. He did hear it. His version had something extra in it, something that came from growing up listening to all kinds of music, not just classical guitar. There were hints of blues and rock, influences from the songs he heard on the radio and the music his classmates talked about. "Jake," Professor Martinez said, leaning forward in his chair, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. How would you feel about auditioning for our music program at the university? Jake's heart stopped. I couldn't afford something like that. We don't have money for college. That's not what I'm asking, the professor said gently. I'm talking about a full scholarship. Room, board, tuition, everything covered. We have programs specifically designed for students with exceptional talent who might not otherwise have the opportunity. The room spun around Jake. A full scholarship to study music at the university. It was something he had never even dared to dream about. But I don't know anything about music theory, he said weakly. I never had proper lessons. We can teach you theory, Professor Martinez said. What we can't teach is what you already have. Heart, soul, the ability to make a guitar sing in a way that moves people to tears. Jake looked at Ms. Rodriguez, who was wiping her eyes and smiling at the same time. He thought about his mother, working double shifts to keep them afloat. He thought about his grandfather, sitting on their porch every evening believing that music belonged to everyone. Maybe it was time to find out where that belief could take him. When would the audition be? Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. Professor Martinez smiled. How about next Friday? I have a feeling the admissions committee is going to want to meet you very soon. The week leading up to the audition passed in a blur of preparation and disbelief. Jake practiced every day until his fingers were sore, but not in the desperate way he used to practice in his bedroom. This time felt different. He wasn't hiding his music anymore. He was getting ready to share it with the world. Ms. Rodriguez had arranged for Jake to use the community center's music room every evening after the regular program ended. She stayed, late to help him prepare, teaching him the formal names for techniques his grandfather had shown him years ago. It turned out Jake had been using advanced classical guitar methods without knowing what they were called. Your grandfather was a genius, she told him Wednesday evening as they worked through a particularly complex piece. He taught you university-level techniques by making them feel like games and stories. You've been playing graduate-level music since you were 14 years old. Jake's mother had taken Friday afternoon off work, something she never did unless someone was sick. She sat in the community center's lobby, wearing the one dress she owned that wasn't a uniform, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When Jake saw her there, he realized how much this moment meant to both of them. The university was only 30 minutes away by bus, but it felt like entering a different world. The campus was huge, with old brick buildings covered in ivy and students walking around with books and laptops like they owned the place. Jake carried his grandfather's guitar case and tried not to look as nervous as he felt. Professor Martinez met them at the music building's entrance. He introduced them to Dr. Williams, the head of the guitar department, and Dr. Chen, who directed the scholarship program. Both professors were friendly, but Jake could see them studying him carefully, trying to figure out what all the fuss was about. The audition room was smaller than Jake had expected, with just a few chairs and excellent acoustics that made every sound crisp and clear. Through the tall windows, Jake could see other students walking across the campus quad, going about their normal Friday afternoon routines, while his entire future hung in the balance. Take your time getting ready, Dr. Williams said kindly. There's no rush. Jake opened his guitar case and lifted out his grandfather's instrument. In this room full of expensive equipment and professional musicians, the old guitar looked even more worn than usual. But when Jake held it, he felt his grandfather's presence like a warm hand on his shoulder. Whenever you're ready, Professor Martinez said, settling into his chair. Jake closed his eyes for a moment and thought about everything that had led him to this room. The summer music program he almost didn't attend. The day he raised his hand when no one else would. The moment Ms. Rodriguez recognized his grandfather's technique. All of it had been leading here, to this audition that would determine whether his dreams were possible or just fantasies. He started with the piece his grandfather had taught him. First, a simple melody that gradually revealed layers of complexity. His fingers found their familiar places on the fretboard, and the nervousness began to fade. This was what he knew how to do. This was who he was. As he played, Jake could feel the room changing around him. The professors stopped shuffling papers and checking their phones. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to move in rhythm with the music. Even the sounds from the hallway outside seemed to quiet down. Jake moved from the simple melody into more complex pieces, letting each song flow naturally into the next. He played the classical exercises his grandfather had disguised as bedtime lullabies. He played the flamenco-influenced pieces that reminded him of stories about Spain. He played the blues-tinged variations he had developed on his own, the ones that came from growing up in America with music from everywhere mixing together in his head. But it was the last piece that made the difference. Without planning it, Jake found himself playing the song his grandfather used to hum while cooking dinner, the melody that had taken Jake 3 years to fully understand. As he played, he could almost smell the rice and beans simmering on their old stove, could almost see his grandfather's weathered hands moving in time with the music. The song started simple, just a basic chord progression that any beginning student could play. But as Jake continued, it grew and evolved, becoming something that told the story of a man who had lost everything and found it again in a small apartment with his grandson. It was about sacrifice and hope and the way music could carry love across generations and continents. When the last note faded away, the silence in the room felt sacred. Jake opened his eyes and saw that Dr. Chen was wiping tears from her cheeks. Professor Martinez was smiling like he had just witnessed something miraculous. Dr. Williams was staring at Jake with an expression of pure amazement. "Jake," Dr. Williams said finally, her voice soft with emotion, "in 30 years of teaching, I have never heard anything quite like that. You don't just play music, you inhabit it." The professors asked Jake a few questions about his training and his goals, but he could tell the real audition was over. They had heard what they needed to hear. As they shook hands and promised to call within a few days, Jake felt like he was floating above the ground. On the bus ride home, Jake's mother held his hand like she used to when he was little. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. They both knew that something fundamental had changed that afternoon. The call came on Sunday morning. Jake was practicing in his bedroom when his phone rang. It was Professor Martinez, and Jake could hear the smile in his voice before he even said hello. "Jake, I have some news for you. The scholarship committee met yesterday evening. They were unanimous. We would like to offer you a full 4-year scholarship to study classical guitar at the university." Jake sat down hard on his bed, the phone shaking in his hand. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. Jake, you're going to be studying with some of the best guitar instructors in the country. You'll have access to our recording studio, our concert hall, and our extensive music library. But more than that, you'll have the chance to develop your gift in ways your grandfather could only have dreamed of." After he hung up, Jake sat in his small bedroom holding his grandfather's guitar and looking around at the space where he had spent so many hours practicing in secret. Soon, he would be living in a dormitory on a university campus, studying music with professors who knew his grandfather's name, preparing for concerts in real theaters with real audiences. But the best part wasn't the scholarship or the opportunities or even the recognition. The best part was knowing that his grandfather's music would live on. The techniques Antonio Rivera had developed in Spanish cafes 50 years ago would continue to evolve and grow through Jake's hands. The stories locked inside that old guitar would finally be told to the world. That evening, Jake called Ms. Rodriguez to share the news. She cried on the phone, telling him how proud she was and how excited she was to follow his career. Then he walked out to the small porch where his grandfather used to play every evening. Jake sat in the same chair the old man had used, positioned his fingers on the familiar frets, and began to play. The music drifted out into the neighborhood, mixing with the sounds of cars and conversations and life going on all around him. For the first time since his grandfather had died, Jake played without worrying about disturbing anyone. He played with the windows open and his heart full, knowing that somewhere in the music floating on the evening air, Antonio Rivera was smiling. The boy who had walked into that community center hoping to remain invisible had found his voice at last. And the world was finally ready to listen.